Punk is about being an outcast, being angry and not caring, being filthy and loud and unavoidable in crowds. Think The Clash, the Sex Pistols, Misfits, Nirvana. But where are the girls? Before the 90s, there weren't a ton of women in the forefront of the punk scene. Sure, there were icons like Sid and Nancy, but in that, Nancy is relegated to a side character. She's objectified. She isn't in control of her own narrative. She wasn't making the music. Where are the kick-ass girls who make kick-ass music? What's harder than being a girl? Seriously. All the pressure to be perfect mixed with the internal rage and self-hatred just festering inside like a blister in the soul? Sometimes screaming and breaking things and being dirty and unkempt and gross is the only remedy. This is the essence of Riot Grrrl. Living in Olympia with the perpetual overcast and nothing to do but smoke weed and play guitar. Something was brewing. A big, angsty, angry movement was coming. Overshadowed by its more successful brother, grunge, Riot Grrrl was something different. While grunge was introspective and self-destructive, Riot Grrrl was more stereotypically punk. Riot Grrrl was a turning point in the history of punk because it created a space for women and female-centric issues. Also, Riot Grrrl gave queer, trans, and BIPOC women a space to be angry and loud. This then creates a better environment for how women were treated in alternative scenes as a whole. In the 70s, with political turmoil in America and England, it was the right time for change. It was the right time for punk. Initially, punk exploded onto the scene with their weird hair, loud music, and eclectic fashion. They were a sight to behold. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, punk got a lot more mainstream and subsequently spread through the world. Suddenly, punks were hit makers. People who weren't punks wanted to look like punks. Record labels crafted people like Billy Idol to try to capture this audience. This perceived lack of authenticity then started the hardcore movement in the mid-80s. It was supposed to be a return to form, a return to a perceived authenticity in the scene. In the hardcore scene specifically, women were referred to as coat hangers and were relegated to the back of venues. They weren't given a real, substantial voice in the scene. Olympia was a different type of city. Evergreen State College was the breeding ground for so many Riot Grrrl bands and scenes, but the real start of Riot Grrrl as it's known was in Washington, D.C. While on a school trip, Kathleen Hanna and Allison Wolf heard of the Girl Riot and girl power, mixed with the role women had in the punk and hardcore scene at the time, being shoved to the back of venues and being called coat hangers by their male peers. From the eyes of two 20-somethings, this was an injustice. Something needed to change. Even though the politics of punk preached equality for all minority groups and a toppling of social norms and governments, the scene was quite often the opposite. What else happens when there's a bunch of sweaty, angry, young men in a room but rampant sexism? This general culture caused the slogan, "Girls to the Front," to become a war call of these bands. And after that, Riot Grrrl spread through the nation. From LA, bands like Babes in Toyland, and all the way to New York with offshoots like Sister Girl. This was something resonating with women and created grounds for change within punk scenes, whether the men liked it or not. Riot Grrrl spaces were not perfect. In fact, they were far from it. The scene was teeming with TERFs. TERFs were a subset of radical feminists that popped up in the 80s and 90s, predominantly in feminist and queer circles. These women not only believed that trans women and trans feminine people were not real women biologically or socially. Although extremely radical feminism was the biggest drawing point to the music to young college-aged women, there were a fair amount of trans feminine and androgynous people in the scene. For the record, punk has always been queer, but in the scene where one of the biggest bands, Tribe 8, had songs called Butch in the Streets and Lesbophobia, it hit harder that trans women were excluded. Riot Grrrl archivist Audrey Wilkinson speaks on the transphobia in the scene. Riot Grrrl shows created a women's space. TERFs feel more comfortable in women's spaces, to the point of policing trans femme gender presentations. This is not exclusive to Riot Grrrl music. This type of transphobia was seen as the logical extension of the pre-existing girl beliefs. However, no girl revolution is complete without the trans women and black women who helped create it. Women of color have historically been underrepresented in punk and the Riot Grrrl movement. Polystyrene was a trendsetter in punk. With her bright, bubblegum-colored outfits and screechy, powerful vocals, she had an incredible impact on both new wave and post-punk. However, her act, X-Ray Specs, was severely undermined by the amount of racism in 1970s England. Because of this, her work could not have reached as wide of an audience. Although it's on the other side of the world, this type of misogynoir was felt throughout alternative scenes in the US. However, this was felt even deeper in Riot Grrrl, a subculture that prided itself on inclusiveness for all women. In reality, though, this meant all white, cisgendered women. Our reaction to the overwhelming whiteness in the scene caused a splinter to form in the community, and this was Sister Grrrl. Sister Grrrl is a turning point because it gave a place for Black and Hispanic women who were often left out. Frontrunners of this movement, Simi Stone, along with Tamara Kali, organized punk shows around New York aimed towards Black women and girls. This movement in the late 90s helped jumpstart the Afropunk movement. However, this movement isn't only confined to Black women. Many other Asian and Hispanic bands have been categorized under the umbrella of Sister Grrrl. Into the new millennia, a new genre was forming. Nu metal took aspects of punk, metal, and most interestingly, rap. Two bands in this genre show a clear Riot Grrrl influence. BIKINI is a Canadian all-female nu metal group that took direct influence from the girls before them, with song titles like Do You Think I'm a and Get Off, You Can Eat a show the Riot Grrrl edge of the band. The lyrics were explicitly feminist, in sharp contrast to other bands in the genre. Lyrically, BIKINI sang about similar things to other Riot Grrrls. Songs like the aforementioned Do You Think I'm a talks at length about sexual trauma and violence against women. This shows how Riot Grrrl, and on a larger scale, women in the alternative scene, are in a flash in a pan and how they're here to stay. Furthermore, this lays out how bands like Bikini Kill have impacted women moving forward. Another female-fronted band that was inescapable in the early 2000s was Evanescence. More specifically, the lead singer and frontwoman Amy Lee. Lee was an outspoken feminist throughout her career, and would talk at length about being one of the only women in nu metal making music. On Facebook in 2020, she stated, "Honestly, women do get skipped over," she begins. "We do get left out of the recap when it all boils down. It is harder to make it onto the cover or the radio, because our face is not the classical quintessential face of rock. If you're thinking of it as a literal face, I think it embodies subconsciously in our brains that women in rock are less authentic somehow. Like we're next gen, we're part 2, we're not the original, a niche little off-brand thing." This still rings true even now. Many contemporary mainstream bands don't have female faces or women in them at all. The fact that a female-fronted metal band can have multiple top 10 hits shows the impact of the scene. Into the 2010s, after a decade it felt like the end of Riot Grrrl, something strange happened. Riot Grrrl came back with the youth. Teenagers on Tumblr and Instagram started reblogging the Riot Grrrl manifesto and connecting with the things that these women were talking about 20 years ago. Around the same time, in the early 2010s, two of the biggest bands in the original scene reunited, Bratmobile and Bikini Kill. This renaissance took a relatively niche subculture from 20 years ago and inspired younger people to get involved. Around 2015 to 2017, a bunch of bands and EPs started surfacing on Bandcamp, Spotify, and YouTube around this time. Some of the most essential Riot Grrrl and Sister Grrrl albums were made in the 2010s by bands like Whatever, Mannequin, and Mommy Longlegs. Since the 2010s, Riot Grrrl has only gotten more diverse since the decade started. Pink Shift is an Indian-fronted band that has seen immense growth and success, which likely wouldn't have been possible in the 90s. On the same page, Sister Grrrl has seen a resurgence in popularity. A defining Sister Grrrl act, Big Joni, was started in 2014 and has gone on tour with Bikini Kill and has been featured on a Sleater-Kinney album. Another defining Sister Grrrl band is the Muslims, whose music leans on the more expressly political side. Many members of the band occupy intersectional identities, which brings a nuance to the subculture that wasn't often seen. This new era of Riot Grrrl is exciting and electric, and similar to the beginning of the scene, albeit in a new way. The amount of diversity in a post-internet world has been staggering since the original 90s scene was seemingly so closed off to minorities. So much has changed in the world since 1991. However, one thing will stay consistent: a need for angry women to vent their frustrations to the world. Alternative scenes are now a better place for this. With the birth of Riot Grrrl, the world saw many doors being opened in alternative spaces. Riot Grrrl was a turning point in the history of punk because it created a space for women and women-centric issues. Finally, Riot Grrrl gave queer, trans, and BIPOC women a space to be angry and loud without consequence. This then creates a better environment for how women are treated in alternative scenes as a whole.